Yeah, so hopefully this will work out a little better than the last time we met.
Oh, the last time.
The last time we met.
I thought that was a perfectly
It worked
pleasant
out.
evening.
It worked out. I just hope there are like fewer concealed weapons in this crowd than there were in the last crowd. So we met and yeah, I was gonna be downtown, and so I suggested we go to Milano. You guys know that bar on Houston Street, right? And I guess
It's a filthy place.
I guess I've only been there really late and really drunk, and so I wasn't really. Well, first of all, I called to make sure that it was going to be open at 4:30 because, you know, some of those she cocktail places in Soho don't open until like 6 or 7. And the woman answered the phone, and I said, so when do you guys open? And she said, 8 a.m. And
So really we should have done it at 8
we really should have done it at 8 a.m. Anyway, so the people we encountered had been there, I think, since 8 a.m.
Yeah, I think there was like a brief scuffle over a shiv as I was walking into the
There was a
bar.
shiv situation, yeah, exactly.
It's scary.
Anyways, yeah. And then there was lots of Grateful Dead on the...
Yeah.
And then, actually the really good thing is that John's tape recorder didn't work, so then we thought, oh, we'll use my iPhone. And then we used my iPhone for the first, 50 minutes. And then we just gossiped like crazy for an hour, and I forgot to turn off my phone, and so the whole conversation was on my iPhone. So that's why, Don, we didn't send it to you for so long, because I had to figure out how to display, how to cut.
Is that right?
Yeah, no, I was going to send that whole thing.
No, because when I got the file,
we
I was
talked
like,
about
this is
everybody
much
in this
shorter.
room, John. Every single person in here.
That's right.
Yeah.
You used your psychic abilities.
We don't want that to get out. Nice things, really complimentary things.
Also, there was about a 38-minute conversation about the Grateful Dead that no one ever needs to hear.
Yeah.
So now we've disclosed that.
Okay. Yeah.
But I thought it was a productive conversation. It was interesting to me.
It was.
We talked a lot. It's impossible to talk to Heidi without talking about all the stuff she's reading and has been reading recently, which is always fun, because I always find out about stuff I didn't know about. And you always surprise me with what you're reading. You went on a long and very charming
all my
rant
students in here are
about.
going to be like, not.
Well, they probably heard this read about the Hunger Games.
Yeah. See, they're all just like, shut up about that.
Yeah.
Anyways, not you.
Can we talk about that briefly?
Yeah.
I'm pissed off about the Hunger Games.
Did you read it?
I have not yet read it.
Oh, well.
So you might think that I'm not allowed to be pissed off.
One of my students over there didn't like it as much as I did.
I'm just angry because and maybe we can have a brief debate about this before moving on.
Okay.
It seems to me, without even reading it, that it is...
That you feel qualified to comment upon.
But it seems to me like a terrible ripoff of a Japanese movie called Battle Royale that came out in 2000, in which a group of teenagers in a futuristic society are forced on television to try and kill each other.
Well, that's so interesting. I
Makes
didn't
me
know
so
about
mad.
that.
I
I
just
didn't know
saw
about
this
that.
movie.
Are you outing? You're outing her. I don't think anyone see.
I'm
the short cultural
piping
memory.
mad right now.
Right. So wait, it's called Battle Royale.
Battle Royale.
And it's Japanese.
It's Japanese. It wasn't released here for a long time because I think they thought it would be too disturbing. But apparently, our culture has declined so much in the last 10 years that now you can make an enormous big-budget movie about the same topic. It's fun.
No, it's true. Although, not to diss the Japanese versions, but did you see the Japanese version of The Ring versus the American
I
version of The
did,
Ring?
yeah. What are you going to say?
I like the American version better. I know you're not supposed to say that.
Is that because you look like Naomi Watts? You identify with her in some way?
Yeah.
I like it better because there was a blonde in it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's my bag.
I didn't see the American version.
You didn't see it? Oh, it was good. I felt it was truly scary. The Japanese version was more campy.
Right, because bad things are just happening to Japanese people, so it wasn't
Exactly.
This conversation is really going south really fast. I think it's
That's my plan. I'm trying to derail this as much as I can.
I was going to find some way of working back into your actual novel, though, which is that it seems to me of your novels, this one is the most sort of structured in a certain way, and it reads the quickest, I would say. It's the most, I guess, the horrible phrase page turning that gets thrown around. Like, I've certainly found it to be that way. And in our conversation, you were talking about books like The Hunger Games and other books, some of them YA, some of them in various genres, in which structure and pacing and just the kind of shape of the narrative were sort of front and center and were the primary strength of the book. Were you reading a lot of that kind of stuff when you were working on Vanishers?
Well, I mean, it's funny, I recently, for example, decided I wanted to reread the books that kept me up all night.
Right.
Right? I mean, and why? Right? Why did they keep me up all night? And sadly, a lot of the books that kept me up all night didn't keep me up all night the second time around. Maybe it's because I already knew what happened. But I do think there's something to be said, and in fact I was talking to somebody about this today. You know, you may not obviously want to be writing like the books that you read when you were younger, you know? You're not going to be writing the Chronicles of Narnia, you're not going to be writing, you know, Tolkien or whatever. I mean, you should be so lucky, you should be so lucky. But all I'm saying is that, you know, you may, those exact kinds of books may not be what you're writing, but I do feel like I'm always trying to replicate the reading experience I had when I read those books.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is kind of what I'm trying to always recapture in some way. Like, think of the experience, not literally of the book and how's the book put together and the pacing of the book, all of that, obviously. As I've been saying to my poor students who are here, I have to hear this again, you know, with something like the Hunger Games, because the language is just very basic, it's not offensive, it's just there, it's just doing its very basic language job. You really can see the structure, like the blueprint of that book just hops out at you. And I find that really useful. I find it useful to read books that are almost like plumbing guides. Which is not to belittle that at all.
No, they're like very well compensated.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. I mean, I remember when I was in grad school and I was with this guy whose name I was actually struggling to remember last night, who, you know, he was writing this crazy, unpublishable, unmarketable fiction, and he decided, he was like, fuck it, I'm gonna write a bestseller, you know? As if this was just this, you know, I'll just give up my ambitions, I'm just going to write a bestseller now.
And that guy's name was Dan Brown.
And that guy's name was Dan Brown. No, you know, and anyone who's actually, I mean, to think that you could just do that, that's not.
No, it's hard.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's hard to get anyone interested in anything. It's hard to keep someone interested in a conversation.
But, you know, I mean, again, you know, to read a book, I think it's very interesting to go back to books where, yes, you're not trying to mimic the style or even the genre or anything, but just to try to extract from it this kind of reading sauce, like the experience sauce, right? And then how can you, right? How can you spread that
That has to be a
over?
catchphrase
Yes.
for future work. just stir the reading sauce. But so did you approach this book in any way differently? Am I off base in feeling like it's a slightly different undertaking than, say, the Uses of Enchantment was?
No, I think, you know, I guess here's my problem, I guess, or struggle or whatever, is that I love plot and I love narrative, but I also am suspicious of traditionally assembled novels. In other words, you know, especially as a teacher and as someone who's read closely for a long time certain books, you know, to take them apart and figure out how to put them back together, certain things start to seem really, really, really artificial. And so subsequently I want to dismantle it a little bit, but I don't want to lose plot and narrative. So how do you do that, right?
Yeah.
And so I do feel like it's been this struggle to keep these two kind of warring sides of myself happy. And I guess with the effect of living backwards, you know, I tried to, I knew that in the first book I wrote, I wasted a lot of time writing about landscape. Like when I didn't know what to do or what was going to happen, I would just write many, many pages of like dust storms and stuff like that. And so I thought, well, that was a huge waste of time. How can I make the next novel experience slightly more expedient? And so I thought, I will make these characters, they have to be on a plane the entire time. Actually, the first draft of that novel, someone was in a bathtub the entire time. I wanted to write a novel where someone was in a bathtub for the whole novel. And then that didn't work, so then I thought, okay, airplane, they'll only be on an airplane, what can they really describe? And also that it was a hijacked airplane and it was on the ground, so it wasn't like, oh, we're looking at the landscape passing by through the window. No, there was no landscape. Well, see, I was just looking for some kind of claustrophobic setting.
Yeah.
Right?
And there's like a flying bathtub.
Yeah, it is. And so it's actually not so different from the 10th Street baths, actually, which is sort of like being on an airplane with lots of other strange naked people. But anyway, when I was in that airplane and I just went crazy. I got so bored. I got bored and I needed to get out. And so then I started to do what were called shame stories, and they were these sort of, it was very Decameron, like trapped people telling stories to each other to keep them interested. But then I had to, it was so hard to make that all stick and work. I mean, in a weird way, it was so reactionary, so it was like a reactionary structure. Yeah. Maybe that's how all structures come about, I don't know. And then with the next book, I did 3 interweaving narratives, right? So that sort of permitted me, and from a certain character from different parts of time in her life and from different people's perspectives. And so that allowed me to do, a narrative, but I was scrambling it and contradicting it, like the different threads were contradicting each other. And then with this one, I guess, I was like, I'm gonna stick with one character. It's not gonna be 3 threads. It's not gonna be any of that stuff. But I think what allowed me to do it is, so she's a psychic, right? And not a terribly good one, or not a very in control one. And
Which is a very good one.
Well, she ends up being a good one unbeknownst to her. She thinks she sucks, and then it turns out she doesn't suck. Like
Which is
all
kind
of
of
us.
like, actually, it's sort of like a YA novel in a way,
It's
right?
totally like a YA
You are the
novel.
chosen one.
It's so true. It's so true. I stole it from a Japanese movie also.
I was building up to that.
I'm waiting for you to bust me. I was like, shit, you Googled it. So all right, so because she's a psychic, she is able to regress herself not into other people's pasts, right? So suddenly it was a way to escape the present narrative, which I'm always looking for some way to do, but it wasn't a flashback. And because I really, as everyone who's in my classes know, I personally, I'm very suspicious of flashbacks. I know they're very necessary, but I would love to find a way not to have to do them, which is why I loved Remainders so much, that Tom McCarthy novel, because in the very first sentence, he's like, I got hit on the head by something, and I don't remember anything about my life before this point. I'm like, wow. I want to hit every single character I ever write again on the head with something, so that they don't have to remember what happened to them before that point.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, in the uses of enchantment, the regressions, in a sense, are like, they're sort of like the opposite of a flashback. Mm-hmm. In a way, we're going back in time, kind of guided by the narrator who's having these psychic experiences, but rather than serving really to illuminate the present or explicate the present, the true mystery of the novel lies in these regressions and the visions and the things, the people she interacts with, these dead people that she interacts with mostly. And what are the meanings, in a way they're the opposite, they're more like dreams, I suppose, than they are flashbacks.
It's true. And I think too with flashbacks, you're still working on a linear plane, right? So you're here, and then you have a flashback to here, and then a flashback to here, and then a flashback to here, right? But it's still like this. Whereas this provided this sort of escape valve, but you're going over here. You're going over here, and you're going over here, and you're going over here. So,
because it's not
her past. It's not her past. It's somebody else's past. So it's a way to get out of that. It's a way to get out of that present trap. It feels. And I mean, I do feel, for me at least, that every novel is a way to figure out how to productively drive myself insane, right? How to set up a situation that I will have to productively react against and come up with some new solution, so that I can escape.
I guess the extreme example of an author who is in that sort of similar situation would be Nicholson Baker, maybe, in some of his books, in which you have the protagonist who literally is stuck in one place, or is going up an escalator, and not only does Nicholson Baker clearly not want to be on the escalator, you don't. So you follow him on these crazy digressions in a way to just escape being trapped on an escalator as it rises.
Or in the Fermata, he's allowed to, he can stop time. so that he can fondle people. And
which is so great that that's the only thing the narrator, I mean, the protagonist of that book is interested in doing. He has the power to stop time. All he wants to do is take ladies' clothes off.
Yeah, that's true. But even that becomes a way that, you know, it's just temporarily messing with the, you know, you're not moving totally forward, and then when you come back, it's like a redo, you know? You've gone for it, and now you go back, and you go forward past that moment. And yeah. I love him.
Nixon Baker.
He's so sweet and bushy bearded
and pervy.
And pervy, which is so, yeah.
The thing with Nixon Baker is I feel like you saw him on the street or in like a library or a supermarket, and you looked at him, you would think to yourself, I bet that guy's a pervert. And he is. Which is kind of great.
I was on this panel with him and Lee Siegel, who had just written that book Against the Internet. I can't remember what it was called, but it was Against the Internet. And anyway, so he was very upset about trolls and the way the discourse had become super adolescent, basically, on the web, and so he was complaining about being called an asshat, I think he was called.
Well, he is.
And it was just amazing because Nicholson Baker just starts chuckling into his beard, and he just says, asshat, that is an amazing word.
Yeah. I mean, really, that validates the internet right there.
It kind of does.
You know what else struck me? We talked for such a long time a few weeks ago, and what's weird is that all these other things have struck me since then. It's sort of like esprit d'escalier, except here we are, deja vu, you have to talk to me again.
Right.
And now I can ask you this other question. You know what struck me, and it didn't strike me while I was reading the book, which is interesting. There were almost no men in the book, really.
No.
And it was
I didn't notice that either.
You didn't notice that?
I didn't notice that either. It's been pointed out to me since.
But you know, it was interesting because obviously in a tangential way, or usually not considered tangential, but the book does deal with feminism. Feminism is at least name-checked in the book. There are various artists and people with various political persuasions who drop that word.
Right.
Never really struck me that way per se, you know, like with a capital F. And yet, reading that book for me as a man, in a way, I realized it's sort of like, you know, seeing like Platoon if you're a woman. You know, it's just kind of like, is it possible you can have like a whole...
I was a women's studies
but there are some men in it.
It was like being in Platoon, actually.
Oh, really?
No.
See, my college, there were like as many men as there were women in the women's studies department, because apparently the word was out that it was an easy way to like meet girls or something.
Right. Yeah. A couple of things. Well, I think it's first of all pretty interesting that that sort of late '80s, early '90s feminism seems to be coming up a lot, right? I mean, it was in Jeffrey Kennedy's book. The characters are actually studying feminism and semiotics.
I always assumed that many people had suggested to Jeffrey Jennings that you should study that a little bit, and so he kind of just worked that into
Yes, exactly. But then, I mean, I think in the Paris Review they just published, was it Luce Rigore or was it Hélène Sixou? One of those two, right? I don't know. So, and those people, I'm like, what? Where? I haven't heard those people since the 80s, you know? Yeah. So somehow that movement in feminism seems to be coming back. But for me, two things kind of got me thinking about this territory again. So my college mentor, who is not at all a psychopath in the manner of the mentor in this book, she's a wonderful woman.
So you have one person you can identify as your mentor.
Yeah. And she's now at Columbia. And so she threw a conference a couple of years ago called, I think it was called What is Feminism Now? Something along those lines, right? And so one of the people who presented was this woman named Jack Halberstam. I think it's Halberstam or Halberstam. And her talk was called Passivity as a Form of Feminist Resistance, right? And I was like, that is so naughty, you know? That is so naughty. I can't believe, you know, I haven't checked in with the feminist movement in a while, but wow, you know?
Did you have the feeling she was trying to
intimidating.
piss people off with this?
Well, interestingly, so, but I mean, the piece that she talked about, which was really pretty fascinating, was Yoko Ono's cut piece from '68,
Right.
I want to say. And that piece is, so Yoko Ono just goes and sits in a gallery, and she's wearing a dress, and there's scissors on the floor, and the gallery goers are supposed to come in and just cut the dress off of her, right? And so as this goes on, the cutting becomes like more and more and more and more aggressive, and she's just sitting there the whole time. And so, you know, then you get to ask yourself, is this an act of, like, is she sort of showing these people, is this a feminist act because she's showing how aggressive these people have become just because she's sitting there with a dress and there's scissors there, or is she a victim, right? And then there was a really fascinating article in Harper's, maybe 2 years ago now, a year and a half, that Susan Faludi wrote, which was called Feminism, American Feminism's Ritual Matricide. And it talked about how each generation of feminists, the way that they make their mark is by rejecting the feminists that came before them, right? And so, and Jack Halberstam was actually mentioned in that piece as, you know, she didn't come off so well in the Faludi piece, let's just put it that way. She seemed very much like, oh, you old fogies, you old 80s people, and you're écriture féminine, you know, like that's just such crap, and you know, we're you know, catch up, ladies, we're in a new place, you know.
Right.
And that just really made me think. I mean, because to be honest, I went on like I've gone on some six-sue rants in the mid '90s when I, you know, just had my fill of woomy, watery women's writing, you know, and I was like, what, isn't there something else? Can't we do something else? And you know, and I went through a phase, you know, after I was a women's studies minor where I only read men. I think I only read men for like 5 years or something, you know? So it gave me pause, and I thought, okay, I've participated in this, you know?
Yeah.
I've participated in this a little bit. So yeah, it's an interesting time. And I mean, I don't feel like I have any kind of agenda or like a sort of polemic I'm pushing through. I'm more interested in, like people who are having a fight about this in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my favorite, you know, what do I want to say? One of my favorite books that enacts this, you know, like how fun is it to do this, is Operation Shylock. And there's a Philip Roth character who is more or less Philip Roth, and then there's a fake Philip Roth who's pretending to be the Philip Roth character, and they have all these really awesome debates about Zionism, you know, and the double fake Philip Roth is advocating for a reverse diaspora, that everybody from Israel should go back to Poland and go back to where they came from. And you know, you can see Philip Roth essentially having a fight with himself on the page,
Right.
which is sort of far more interesting than just being like, it should be this way.
Right. But that whole kind of kill your idols sort of young up and coming generation overturning in a more or less kind of violent way the people who were their models as they were coming up is sort of exactly what the Vanishers is about to some degree.
Yeah.
Right? Because
I mean,
you
I
have
hope
this.
at the end there is this sort of, you know, I never can really write a happy ending, but that it's, that there's some hope that there can be, a middle ground, you know. But also I feel like the main character really realizes, you know, the costs of being that kind of matricidal figure.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
What's interesting, one of the things that also I noticed recently is that the book starts out and sort of the jacket cover of the book emphasizes the struggle between the narrator protagonist, who's this up-and-coming psychic with far more psychic ability than she or anyone else seems to credit her with having, except for her mentor,
Right.
who secretly realizes that she's this very powerful psychic who will come to displace her. In a way, it's kind of like the Snow White dynamic or something. And yet, she's the only person who realizes it, so therefore she can kind of secretly destroy her without anyone really kind of knowing what might happen. But then it shifts, then the book shifts, and the primary sort of relationship of the book turns out not so much to be between Julia and Madame Ackerman, her psychic mentor, who is also trying to destroy her then, but in fact between Julia and her mother. And her mother even becomes, in a way, and I don't know if this is not too much of a spoiler, the kind of antagonist, even though she's long since dead. So what made you decide, was that just one of those things where you were writing along and you just felt this shift and you just kind of went with it? Did you know from the beginning that the mom was going to kind of supplant Madame Ackerman in importance?
Well, I mean, I guess I like power shifts. I like it when power dynamics sort of somersault over each other, and that was definitely kind of the turbine that drove the uses of enchantment. I mean, everything was just like, who has the control, you know, and who has the power, and it was always sort of flipping on itself, right? And I also admittedly have kind of a binary problem, you know? I mean, I just feel like I've just come up with all these sort of like, it's always like these two people, these two people, these two people, these two people, and each binary ends up kind of overlapping with the other ones and playing out certain dynamics that the other binaries can't play out, you know? So, yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of mother-daughter binaries in the book. There's Alwyn and her mother. Alwyn is this sort of crazy, paranoid person that gets involved with the main character. Julia and her mother, Julia and Madame Ackerman, Julia and the woman she meets at the spa, etc., right? So it's all these sort of almost like doppelganger conflicts, or how do I want to say, like parallel plot points in a weird way, right? So that not only kind of reinforce what's going on in the other binaries, but also sort of suggest where things are going, if that makes sense.
I'm not entirely sure, though, that it's, you know, that every novel couldn't be broken down to a series of binary
It's probably true.
relationships, you know?
It's probably true.
I mean, I can't imagine, I mean, maybe I just don't have a very geometrically developed
What about your
mind.
novel Three-Way?
My novel Three-Way?
Yeah.
But there was still, you know, this, you know, yeah, Raoul was doing Chico, and Chico was doing...
Right.
But what was I going to say? What I found, another thing that I found interesting, which I may or may not have mentioned in that grungy bar we were in the other week, is that even though there's almost no sex in the novel, like almost no one has sex with anybody else, at least in a way that we, you know, there are. It's mentioned or alluded to or whatever. Wait, what did you say?
That you approve of? There's
Yeah, I don't really approve of it. It wasn't enough menage a trois. No, even though there's not really a lot of sort of getting it on, and even though the mother-daughter relationship, you know, surrogate mother, surrogate daughter relationship, whatever, is so front and center, every relationship is also sexualized.
Yeah.
In a way, between all the different women.
Yeah.
There's this kind of simmering, I would call it like either anywhere running the gamut between like a proto-sexual to like a pretty much fully on acknowledged sexual tension at the very least, almost in every possible direction.
Yeah.
So it is sort of like a three-way, except it's more like a 12-way.
12-way, yeah.
Which is, you know, that's pretty hot, right?
Yeah. I don't know. It's so funny. My mother-in-law wrote me the weirdest email after she read this book.
Which is funny because the mother-in-law is sort of like the one non-sexy character.
That's true.
Right? She's just kind of nice.
That's true. The stepmother. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Right. No, it's true. It's funny. I was like, wait, is there a mother-in-law? I always forget. I once had a bookseller come up to me and she was like, you know, I really, really wanted to know why this character, da-da-da, and I was like, oh, this poor woman, she has me confused for somebody else. And then it turned out, oh, right, I forgot I had someone like named that.
I have stepmother, mother-in-law, dyslexia.
Right. Well, anyway, so yeah, so my mother-in-law, and I mean, whatever, everything has to be read through, like there's a lot of hostility being communicated, even if you don't necessarily see it on the first read, you know it's there somewhere. And so, anyways.
That's what she assumes, you mean?
No, that's how I.
Oh, that's what you assume?
Yeah. Assume.
In all your interactions.
So she wrote that. She said something about like, this is like the most sexless, or I don't know. She said something that made me feel like she was calling me a prude. I don't know, right? But that said, Oh, God. I mean, I will say, after I finished this novel, I decided I was just going to write a full-on erotic novel. That I had to, somehow I had to confront the, I don't know if it's the inability to write about actual sex, or maybe I'm just not interested in writing about actual sex. I mean, do you write about a lot of actual sex?
Yeah, I was writing about a lot of actual sex earlier today.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard, right? I find it's really, I mean, there was that interesting piece that Katie Royfey wrote, which we all know about, right? The piece that was in the Times, is that where it was? Where she wrote about how nobody writes about sex anymore, everyone's uptight, there's no more Norman Mailers in the world, Dave Eggers and Michael Chabon and everybody else, just, they're almost like these latent men who can't write about, getting it on, right?
Well, the idea of Michael Chabon writing about getting it on is like kind of frightening to me. I feel like there would be some kind of like, I don't know, alien involved.
Yeah, so
there was no sex in John Carter, though. Actually, you're right.
There was no sex?
No.
That's interesting.
Makes sense.
All you Taylor Kitsch fans, I guess. Darn.
But, I know, right?
Yeah.
Now no one's going to go see John Carter.
Now no one's going to see it. I know. But yeah, I would like to think it's not a prudishness and more kind of I'm weirdly disinterested in heterosexual sex as a literary topic. I kind of am.
Yeah,
I'm not, and maybe that makes me a prude, or I guess I'm more interested in unspoken sexual tensions and unacted upon, and I think that's why, especially all of the characters being women, I just feel like there's so much, and it's not just sexual tension. I feel like there's something very confusing in a way about the way that women can relate to each other, and what I didn't quite get to when I was reading is, there's that moment where you're like, do I want to fuck her or do I want to be her, right?
Right.
And by fuck her I mean like, and destroy her, right? Right? I mean, it's just this weird, I feel like it's all so blurry and crazy, and there's a sexual element to it, I guess. And that interests me more because it's more interesting.
Well, it makes much more sense in terms of the way this book works. I mean, frankly, if any of the various characters who had these extremely complex and extremely charged emotions towards one another, we're all having sex with one another.
Right.
Sort of almost none of the significant events of the book would take place, right?
Right.
I mean, sublimated sexual energy is a huge part of the very, very tense and very charged and very sexual dynamic there. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like a certain type of film or a certain kind of television show or even a book in which once the kind of sexual action happens, there's just a deflation of interest. There's a loss of the tension.
Yeah.
And I think we summed it up. I think we were both very pleased with ourselves for summing up this confused relationship, for example, that Julia has with this older and very sexy psychic mentor as, I think you said it's like a sexual desire for someone's identity.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There we go. There you have it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there is that, yeah, I don't really know how to improve on that. That's
So now I can
good.
finally ask you
Right.
the question I didn't get a chance to ask you before, which is why did you stop playing poker with us? But maybe we should talk about this later.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I was, you guys look so far away. They look really far away. They live in Brooklyn.
I tried my best to lose, as I recall.
I know. Can I be completely honest, actually?
Yeah, be absolutely
Okay,
honest.
I'll be totally honest. There was way too much talk about Bob Dylan. People just talked about Bob Dylan way too much.
Whereas I now know that you'd be much more into a Grateful Dead conversation, so.
Yeah. It was like idolatry, and it was like trading baseball cards with a bunch of guys, right? It's
I,
like,
you know what? I know
got-
exactly who you
know?
are referring to primarily. I'm not going to mention any names, but there's a bit of Bob Dylan worship there.
Yeah, and also, just that way that, anyways, so that's why, if you want to know that honest to God truth.
How was it?
Yeah. And it's funny because at The Believer, people kept pitching me Bob Dylan pieces. God, go away! Bob Dylan people, go away!